The Mafia boss braced for a loveless arranged marriage, until the bride's fallen veil stopped his heart. For a man who buried his own heart, an arranged marriage is just a contract of blood and silence. Draven Volkov, the crow, the Dawn feared by all and known by none, believed there was nothing left to feel. The marriage to a rival house's daughter was meant to be the final move to secure his empire, the bride merely a pawn, a sacrifice, a nameless face. But when the bride's veil falls, it is not the future he sees. It is the ghost of the one past he could not destroy. 10 years of hatred collide with a buried truth. Vengeance clashes with a sacrifice he never understood. And in an empire built on lies, her face becomes the only truth, and his greatest weakness. This is the saga of the Crow's Vow, a story of power, lies, and a love forged in the fire of betrayal. If you are ready to unravel every secret and feel every beat of this broken heart, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single chapter. And comment below. What do you think he saw in her face? Prepare yourself. The ceremony is about to begin. The air in the Volkov private chapel was ancient and thin. It carried the scent of damp stone and the faint cloying sweetness of incense, a futile attempt to purify a place that had only ever known covenants of blood and power. White lilies, funereal in their perfection, stood in stark arrangements against the dark wood of the pews. They were the only witnesses to the silent transaction. Draven Volkov stood at the altar, a monolith carved from obsidian and tailored wool. The anemic light from the stained glass windows painted the marble floor in dull bruises of blue and crimson. He felt the weight of his men's stares at his back, silent and heavy as lead. He felt the glares from her family, the few that remained across the aisle, a pathetic mix of fear and resentment. Vultures waiting for the scraps of a fallen empire, the Moretti Empire. To him, this was not a sacrament. It was the final annexation of territory. The bride, a name on a contract, the last piece in a bloody puzzle, was merely that. A pawn. A living deed. A sacrifice her family offered to ensure their own survival. He felt nothing. It was a skill he had perfected over a decade of methodical emptiness. Emotion was a liability, a flaw his father had beaten out of him long ago. One more minute, and I will drag her here myself. The thought was cold and sharp, a sliver of ice in his mind. His jaw tightened, the only outward sign of his impatience. Then, the sound. The solitary echo of a single pair of heels on the marble corridor. It was a delicate sound, yet it cut through the tense silence of the chapel like a gunshot. The heavy oak doors swung open. She was a figure of anonymous grace, shrouded in white silk, that did nothing to betray the form beneath. The veil was the true barrier, a thick embroidered curtain that hid her face, her hair, her identity. She was an object, not a person, an effigy of peace between two houses. As she walked towards him, her gait was not the hesitant shuffle of a nervous bride, but the controlled, rigid march of a soldier heading for the gallows. When she stopped beside him, he caught her scent for the first time. It was not a cloying perfume chosen to entice a husband. It was the clean, sharp fragrance of soap and something else. Something elemental, like the air just before a storm. Ozone and foreboding. It pricked at a memory he refused to acknowledge. The priest, a man whose loyalty was bought and paid for, began to murmur the ancient words. The sound was a low, monotonous drone, lost in the hollow space of the chapel. Draven did not listen. His gaze was fixed on the screen of white lace. He just needed the veil to be lifted. He needed the farce to end so the reality of his victory could begin. You may lift the veil. He moved, his motions deliberate, stripped of all emotion. His fingers, encased in thin leather gloves, reached for the delicate edge of the fabric. He felt it then. A tremor. Not in the veil, but in the woman herself. A vibration of suppressed energy that traveled from her, through the lace, and into his fingertips. Fear, he concluded with a sliver of cold satisfaction. Good. He lifted the veil, and the world stopped. It did not slow. It did not blur. It fractured, shattering into a million silent, glittering pieces. Time ceased to exist. The dust motes dancing in the stained glass light froze mid-air. The drone of the priest vanished. The only thing that remained was the face before him. No. Impossible. A ghost. Serafina. The name was not a thought. It was a detonation deep within the hollowed-out cavern of his chest. His heart, a dead, useless organ he had carried for 10 years, gave a single, violent, agonizing lurch, as if breaking through the ribs that caged it. It stole the air from his lungs, leaving a burning vacuum in its place. It was the same face that haunted the edges of his sleep, the one he saw in the flames of the fireplace on long, silent nights. The high cheekbones, the delicate line of her jaw, the lips he had once known better than his own name. But the eyes, God, the eyes were different. The soft, sea-green eyes of the girl he remembered had been replaced. The woman before him had eyes the color of a winter lake, deep and cold and terrifyingly clear. And in their depths, he saw the reflection of a monster. He was the monster. Serafina Moretti stared back at him, and her own shock was a mirror of his. For a split second, he saw the ghost of the girl in her wide, disbelieving gaze. Then it was gone. An arctic frost spread across her features, freezing the shock into something harder, sharper. A decade of grief and whispered betrayals crystallized into pure, undiluted hatred. The boy she had loved, the boy who had vanished in a night of fire and death, was gone. In his place stood this man, this stranger wearing his face, his features hardened by cruelty. The boyish softness brutally erased and replaced by the cold, lethal authority of a Don. The man who, she had been told, had given the order that destroyed her world. The priest, oblivious to the silent cataclysm at the altar, cleared his throat. "I now pronounce you." Draven heard nothing. His entire being was focused on the impossible woman in front of him. The girl he had been told burned with her family. The girl whose supposed death had been the final, perfect stone in the wall he'd built around his soul. The lie that had defined his entire existence was standing before him, breathing his air, and she hated him. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. She thinks it was me. Husband and wife. The silence that followed was a living thing, thick and suffocating. All eyes were on them. Tradition demanded a kiss, a seal on the contract. He saw the subtle flinch in her posture, the way her hands, hidden by a bouquet of funereal lilies, clenched into fists. He leaned in, his body a rigid machine. The scent of her, that impossible memory-laden scent of an oncoming storm, filled his senses. He could feel the warmth radiating from her skin, feel her breath catch and hold in her throat. He did not aim for her lips. To do so would be a profanity beyond measure. Instead, he brushed his mouth against her temple. The touch was cold, fleeting. The leather of his glove a sterile barrier between his hand and her skin. It was a gesture so devoid of warmth, so utterly empty of passion, that it felt like an act of desecration. He felt a violent shiver rack her body, a shudder of pure, unadulterated revulsion. He pulled back, his gray eyes locking with her frozen green ones. The war had just begun. He leaned closer, his voice a low, chilling whisper meant only for her ears, a sound that cut through the silence like splintering ice. "Let's finish this." The ride from the chapel was a blur of muted gray. Serafina sat perfectly still, her spine a rod of iron against the plush leather of the back seat. She stared out the window, but she saw nothing of the city. Not the stoic stone buildings, or the faceless people hurrying along the pavements. Her entire universe had collapsed into the suffocating confines of the car, into the silent, oppressive presence of the man beside her. Draven Volkov. She refused to think the other name. That name belonged to a boy with laughter in his eyes and the warmth of the sun on his skin. It belonged to stolen moments in her family's gardens, to whispered promises under a canopy of stars. That boy was dead. He had burned to ash with her family, with her life, with her heart. This man was a stranger, a usurper wearing a ghost's face. The air in the car was thick with things unsaid. It smelled of expensive leather and his cologne, a cold, sharp scent like winter woods and something metallic, like blood long since washed away. Every breath she took felt like inhaling poison. She focused on the rigid set of her hands in her lap, her knuckles white, the stems of the now unwanted lilies crushed between her fingers. Don't look at him. Don't speak to him. Don't let him see you break. The words were a mantra, a prayer to a god she no longer believed in. She could feel his gaze on her, heavy and searing. It was a physical weight, pressing down on her, demanding a reaction she would die before giving. The silence stretched, thin and brittle, until she thought it might snap and slash them both to ribbons. The car finally swept through a pair of colossal iron gates, the bars wrought into the shape of circling crows. The estate was not a home. It was a fortress of dark stone and shadowed glass, stark and imposing against the bruised twilight sky. It rose from the earth like a monument to power, cold and utterly devoid of life. Her new prison. The vehicle stopped. A door was opened by a man with a face as blank as a tombstone. Draven exited first, then turned, his hand offered to her. She ignored it, stepping out of the car on her own, the silk of her wedding dress whispering against the gravel. The act of defiance was small, petty, but it was all she had. She felt a flicker of satisfaction when she saw his hand drop, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. He led her inside. The interior was as cold as the exterior. Vast, echoing halls of polished marble, cavernous rooms filled with dark, severe furniture. It was a mausoleum, not a home. Staff lined the entryway, their heads bowed, their faces carefully neutral. They were not servants. They were guards, and she was the prize prisoner. He led her up a sweeping staircase, their footsteps the only sound in the crushing silence. He did not touch her, yet she felt as though she were being dragged by an invisible chain. He stopped before a set of double doors and pushed them open, gesturing for her to enter. The master suite. It was larger than the entire apartment she and her younger brother had been hiding in for the past year. A vast, impersonal space dominated by a massive bed and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out onto the sprawling, dark gardens. It was a room designed to showcase wealth, not to offer comfort. A beautiful, perfect, gilded cage. He closed the doors behind them. The click of the latch was a sound of finality. It was the sound of her world shrinking to the size of this room, to the space between herself and the monster she had just married. Now she turned to face him. The mask of calm she had so carefully constructed was beginning to crack. Why? The word was a shard of glass, torn from her throat. He stood by the door, his stillness that of a predator. He had removed his gloves and his hands were bare. Large, capable hands. She remembered them gentle. Now she could only imagine them stained with blood. You'll have to be more specific. His voice was low, a controlled rumble that vibrated through the floor. Don't play games with me. A tremor of rage, hot and raw, finally broke through her control. 10 years. 10 years I believed you were dead. I grieved you, you bastard. The epithet was a poor substitute for the litany of curses screaming in her mind. Was it all a lie? Was sending your father to burn my family alive part of the plan from the beginning? For the first time, she saw a crack in his own granite facade. It was a flicker in his storm-gray eyes, a sudden sharp intake of breath. He moved away from the door, his movements slow, as if wading through deep water. My father? He repeated, the words laced with a confusion that sounded so genuine it infuriated her. Oh, don't feign ignorance now, Volkov, she spat, the name a deliberate poison on her tongue. You, your father, it makes no difference. The Volkovs destroyed the Morettis, and you stand here, ready to claim the last prize. He stopped in the center of the room, turning to face her fully. The faint light from outside carved his face into harsh angles and deep shadows. He looked haunted. I was told you were dead, he said. his voice raw, stripped of its earlier control. "They told me you died in the fire with your parents." The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. She staggered back a step, her mind reeling. A lie. It had to be a lie. A cruel, manipulative trick to throw her off balance. She had spent a decade building her hatred on the foundation of his betrayal. To even consider that he might be a victim too, it was unthinkable. The entire structure of her survival would collapse. "A convenient story," she managed, her voice shaking. "One that let you sleep at night, I suppose? After you took everything?" "I took nothing," he countered, his voice rising, a low, dangerous growl. "I was sent away that night. When I returned, everything was ash, and you were gone. I looked for you." "Liar!" The word ripped out of her, raw and desperate. She could not believe him. She would not. "It's the truth." His eyes burned into hers, and in their depths she saw a pain so profound it mirrored her own. For a terrifying second she saw the boy again, lost and broken. She turned away, wrapping her arms around herself. She could not look at him. She could not bear the flicker of doubt, the treacherous seed of confusion he had planted in the barren soil of her hatred. "I don't believe you," she whispered to the cold glass of the window. A heavy silence descended. She heard him move, the soft sound of his shoes on the thick rug. He didn't come closer. He went to the far side of the room, where a set of wardrobes stood. "This marriage was a business deal, Serafina," he said, his voice regaining its cold composure. "It was the final move to absorb what was left of the Moretti territory and end the bloodshed. I had no idea it was you, until I lifted that veil." She flinched at the memory, the violent, painful thump of her own heart, the look on his face. "Believe what you want," he continued, his back to her. "But we are bound by this. By the vow and by the eyes of every soldier in this city. You are my wife, and that makes you a target." He finally turned, his face unreadable once more. "This side of the room is yours. Your things will be brought up. I will take the adjoining suite. You will not be a prisoner here, but you will not be free. You will have guards. For your own protection." Protection? Or to keep me from running? She thought bitterly. He walked towards the door to the adjoining room, pausing with his hand on the knob. He looked at her one last time, his gaze sweeping over her, a flicker of something unreadable, agony, regret, in his eyes before the mask slammed back into place. "Welcome home, Mrs. Volkov." The door closed behind him, the sound echoing in the cavernous silence of the room. Serafina stood frozen for a long moment, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Then, a shudder racked her body, a violent, soul-deep tremor. Her legs gave way, and she sank onto the cold, silk-covered bed, the wedding dress pooling around her like a shroud. He had looked for her. It was a lie. It had to be a lie. But as she stared at her reflection in the dark window, a pale, haunted woman in a white dress, a new, more terrifying thought emerged. What if it wasn't? And in that moment, she hated him. She hated the monster who had taken everything from her. But even more than that, she hated the ghost of the boy who could make her doubt. Sleep did not come. Serafina merely drifted in a gray, restless limbo, her body too exhausted to move, her mind too tormented to rest, when the first pale fingers of dawn crept through the vast, uncurtained windows. They felt less like a new day, and more like an illumination of her cage. The light spilled across the room, catching on the gilded edges of ornate furniture, the impossibly high thread count of the silk sheets, the cold, polished sheen of the marble floors. It was the wealth of a king, and it felt like the spoils of a war waged on her soul. She pushed herself out of the enormous bed, the cool air raising goosebumps on her arms. She was still in the undergarment from her wedding dress, a simple slip of silk that felt foreign and flimsy in the morning light. Her reflection in the dark glass of the window was that of a stranger, a pale, haunted wraith, lost in a room built for a queen. A soft knock at the door made her flinch. It was a sound too gentle for this house of stone and iron. Before she could answer, the door opened, and a woman in a crisp gray uniform entered, her eyes cast respectfully downward. She was older, with lines of weary kindness etched around her mouth. "Good morning, Mrs. Volkov," the woman said, her voice a soft murmur. "My name is Elena. I was instructed to attend to you." Mrs. Volkov. The name was a physical blow, a brand seared onto her skin. Serafina wrapped her arms around herself. "I don't need an attendant." "Of course, madam," Elena said, her tone unchanging. "Mr. Volkov had these sent up for you. He thought you might be more comfortable." She gestured to a series of garment bags laid out on a chaise lounge, the logos of expensive designers discreetly visible. Serafina's eyes hardened. The gesture was not one of kindness, it was one of ownership. He sought to erase every last trace of her old life, to dress his new possession in the livery of his wealth. "No," she said, her voice sharp. "My own things. Where are they?" Elena hesitated for a fraction of a second, the first sign of uncertainty Serafina had seen in this house. "They are being brought from your former residence, madam. They will be here shortly. Then I will wait." She walked towards the bathroom, a cavern of marble and chrome, and closed the door with a decisive click. It was a small, hollow victory, but it was hers. She would not be his doll, dressed and displayed. She would cling to every last shred of Serafina Moretti until her fingers bled. When her luggage arrived, she ignored the silks and cashmeres Elena began to unpack. She found what she was looking for at the bottom of a worn suitcase, a pair of simple black trousers and a soft gray sweater, threadbare at the cuffs. They were the clothes of a survivor, not a queen. Dressed in her own armor, she felt marginally more like herself. Elena was waiting when she emerged. "Mr. Volkov is waiting for you for breakfast in the solarium, madam." It was not an invitation. It was a summons. The solarium was a jarring contrast to the rest of the mansion. It was a room made of glass, overlooking the meticulously manicured gardens, now gray and damp in the morning mist. The light was bright, almost clinical. It left no room for shadows. Draven was already there, seated at one end of a long, polished table. An ocean of mahogany lay between them. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit, a newspaper folded beside his plate. He looked up as she entered, and his gray eyes swept over her, taking in her plain, worn clothes. She saw a flicker of something, annoyance, surprise, before his expression became a familiar, unreadable mask. He rose with a cold formality until she took her seat at the opposite end of the table. The silence was deafening, broken only by the quiet clink of silver as a servant poured her coffee. The aroma was rich and dark, but it tasted like ash in her mouth. "I trust you had a comfortable night," he said, the words a mockery of polite conversation. "I'm not here to be comfortable," she replied, her voice low and steady. She met his gaze across the vast expanse of the table. "I'm here to be your prisoner. Let's not pretend otherwise." A muscle jumped in his jaw. "A prisoner is someone who has been taken. You, as I recall, came willingly. You made a vow." "A vow made to a stranger," she shot back, "before I knew who was beneath the veil." "And I to a ghost," he countered, his voice dropping, the sound dangerously soft. It seems we were both deceived. The air crackled between them. This was the true nature of their marriage, a battle of wills, a war fought with silences and loaded words. She refused to look away. She would not be the first to break. "My brother," she said, changing tactics. The name felt like a prayer and a weakness on her tongue. "Leo. Where is he?" Draven placed his fork down with deliberate precision. He looked at her, and for a moment, the mask slipped. She saw a flicker of weariness, the deep, profound exhaustion of a man who carried the weight of an empire. "He is safe," he said. "Safe where? In a dungeon in this fortress? Another one of your possessions?" "He is at a country estate, 3 hours north of the city," Draven stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "It is quiet. secure. I have arranged for tutors. His education will not be interrupted. Serafina stared at him, her mind refusing to process the words. Tutors. A country estate. The image was so wildly at odds with the narrative of pure villainy she had clung to. A monster would have used Leo. A monster would have locked him away, holding him as leverage, a knife to her throat. The confusion must have shown on her face. Did you think I would harm him? He asked, a bitter, ironic edge to his voice. He is a boy. He is your family. And as such, he is now under my protection. Protection? The word came out as a strangled whisper. Outrage warred with a dizzying, unwelcome wave of relief. You had no right. You moved my brother without my permission, without even telling me. I had every right, he interrupted, his voice like steel. The moment you became my wife, his safety became my responsibility. A responsibility I take more seriously than you can possibly imagine. Did you think our enemies, my enemies, would not see a 14-year-old boy as the perfect leverage against me? Against us. He stood up, his presence suddenly dominating the bright, airy room. You see this house as a cage, Serafina. You are not wrong. But you fail to see that the walls are not only to keep you in. They are to keep the wolves out. He walked around the table, stopping not beside her but a few feet away, near the glass wall that looked out onto the mist-shrouded garden. You hate me. Good. It will keep you sharp, he said, his gaze fixed on the outside world. But do not let your hatred make you a fool. Your brother is safer than he has ever been. And so are you. He turned his head slightly, his profile sharp and severe against the pale light. You will be allowed to speak with him by phone this evening, to reassure yourself. But until you understand the world you now inhabit, you will not be leaving these grounds. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the solarium, leaving her alone in the crushing, silent brightness. Serafina sat frozen, her hands clenched in her lap. Her coffee was cold, her breakfast untouched. He had not answered her accusations. He had not denied his role in her family's destruction. He had simply changed the rules of the game. The monster she had constructed in her mind for 10 years would have used her brother to control her. Draven Volkov had just protected him. A crack. A tiny hairline fracture spiderwebbed across the thick, impenetrable armor of her hate. She stared out at the gray, silent garden, and for the first time in a decade, she was faced with a question that had no easy answer. If Draven was protecting them from wolves, who, exactly, were the wolves? The hours that followed breakfast were a study in silent defiance. Serafina refused to remain in the master suite, a space that felt more like a showroom than a sanctuary. She began to explore. It was a slow, deliberate act of reclamation, a mapping of the boundaries of her new reality. She trailed her fingers over polished banisters, her reflection a fleeting ghost in the dark, lacquered wood of ancient tables. She noted the guards, men in dark suits who were masters of melting into the shadows, their presence a constant low hum of surveillance. They did not stop her, but their eyes followed her every move. She found the library. It was 2 stories high, a cathedral of books with shelves that stretched towards a vaulted ceiling. The air smelled of aged paper, leather, and wood smoke from a fireplace that was, for once, cold and dark. Unlike the rest of the mansion, this room felt lived in. There were books left open on tables, a half-empty glass of what looked like whiskey on a mantelpiece, a heavy throw blanket carelessly draped over a worn leather armchair. This was his space, his sanctuary, and she was invading it. Good. She ran her fingers along the spines of the books, the titles a mix of classic literature, dense histories, and strategic treatises in various languages. It was the library of a scholar and a general, a man who learned from the dead to conquer the living. Her search was aimless until her eyes caught on a small, unassuming rosewood box on a lower shelf, tucked behind a row of larger volumes. It wasn't the box itself that made her breath catch. It was the intricate silver inlay on the lid, a delicate pattern of a crow intertwined with a thorny rose, a pattern she knew as well as her own heartbeat. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. The wood was cool and smooth beneath her fingertips, the weight of it achingly familiar. It was impossible. It couldn't be. Hers was gone, lost to the fire, a casualty of the night that had claimed everything else. Yet here it was. With shaking fingers, she found the small brass key still tucked into its hidden slot at the base. She turned it. A soft, hesitant melody began to play. A simple, haunting lullaby. The library dissolved. The scent of old books was replaced by the sweet, heavy fragrance of night-blooming jasmine from her mother's garden. The chill of the mansion vanished, replaced by the warmth of a summer evening. She is 16 again. She is sitting on a stone bench with a boy whose eyes hold the gray of a coming storm, but whose smile is pure sunlight. He places the box in her hands. "A crow for Volkov, a rose for Moretti," he says, his voice still holding the rough edges of youth. He traces the silver inlay with his finger. "So, you don't forget me when I'm gone. You're only going for a month," she laughs. But she clutches the box to her chest as if it were a holy relic. "I won't forget you. Promise?" "I promise." The smell of jasmine turned to the acrid, choking stench of smoke. The sound of the lullaby was drowned out by the roar of flames and the splintering of wood. Her promise, a thing of ash and memory. The music stopped. The abrupt silence was more jarring than the melody itself. Serafina's eyes snapped open. Tears she hadn't realized she was crying now cold on her cheeks. Draven was standing in the doorway. He wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the music box in her hands, and his face was a mask of raw, unguarded shock. The blood had drained from his face, leaving him looking ashen, spectral. He looked as though he had seen a ghost, and in a way, he had. "Where?" he said, his voice a rasp, a sound of grinding stone. "Did you get that?" Serafina's shock curdled back into a fresh wave of bitter anger. How dare he? How dare he feign ignorance about the one piece of her past he had allowed her to keep? "You tell me," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "Was this another one of your trophies? A souvenir from the night you burned my life to the ground? Did you pick it from the ashes yourself?" He took a step into the room, then another. His movements were stiff, unnatural. "From the ashes? That's impossible." "Is it? It seems you specialize in the impossible." She held it out to him, a bitter offering. "Here, take it. Add it to the rest of your collection. The Moretti name, the Moretti lands, the Moretti daughter." He ignored her words. His eyes, burning with an intensity that made her skin prickle, were still locked on the box. "My father told me it melted in the fire," he said, almost to himself. "He said he found what was left of it, that it was destroyed. With you." Serafina froze, his words slicing through her rage. The air left her lungs in a silent rush. His father. Again, his father. "What are you talking about?" she whispered. "It was never in the fire. I took it with me when I escaped." She clutched the box to her chest, a shield against his confusing, world-altering words. It was the one thing she had managed to save, the one tangible proof of a time before the inferno. He finally looked at her, his eyes a swirling tempest of confusion, and something that looked terrifyingly like hope. "You took it with you?" "Yes. It was in my room. I grabbed it before I—" She trailed off, the memory of climbing out her window, the heat of the fire at her back, still sharp enough to steal her breath. Draven stared at her, then back at the box, as if trying to reconcile two completely different realities. "My father gave me the melted remains, a lump of charred wood and molten silver. He told me it was all they found of the box, a sign that you were gone." The two statements hung in the silent, dust-mote-filled air between them, utterly irreconcilable. He believed the box was destroyed. She held it in her hands. One of them had been lied to, a deliberate, cruel, and masterful lie. The hatred that had been her constant companion for a decade felt suddenly thin, brittle. It was a shield, but a shield against the wrong enemy. The confusion was a physical thing now, a dizzying vertigo. She looked at the hard, cruel face of the man she had vowed to hate forever, and for the first time saw not the architect of her pain, but another victim of it. He took a hesitant step closer, his hand half reaching for the box before he stopped himself. The control was back in his posture, but his eyes were still raw. "I mourned you, Serafina," he said, his voice low and guttural, each word torn from a place of deep, ancient pain. "I mourned that box." She had no answer. There was nothing to say. The foundation of her world, built on the certainty of his betrayal, had just crumbled into dust. He looked at her, his gaze intense, searching. The question was no longer about hate. It was about truth. "Then one of us," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "is remembering a lie." The library became a tomb of unspoken truths. After the revelation of the music box, a chasm of silence had opened between them, deeper and more terrifying than the anger that had preceded it. Serafina retreated to her side of the mansion, the box clutched in her hands, a relic of a past that was now shrouded in a suffocating fog of deceit. Draven vanished into the depths of his study, the heavy oak door closing with a sound of grim finality. They were two ghosts rattling around in a fortress, haunted not by each other, but by the shared specter of a monumental lie. Serafina spent the afternoon by the window of her suite, watching the sky bleed from gray to a bruised purple. The mantra of her hatred, the simple, clean narrative of his betrayal, had been shattered. In its place was a tangled, thorny mess of questions. If he hadn't betrayed her, who had? If he had mourned her, what did that make the cold, ruthless Dawn he had become? She was so lost in the labyrinth of her thoughts that she barely registered the sound of a car approaching, its tires crunching on the gravel drive below. It was a sleek black sedan, not one of the armored SUVs favored by the Volkov fleet. It looked sleek, predatory. From her vantage point, she saw Draven exit the house, not with the usual retinue of guards, but with only one of his senior men, a grim-faced man named Dmitri. He was dressed in a heavy overcoat, the collar turned up against the biting wind. He was leaving. The thought sent a strange, unwelcome pang through her chest, a mix of relief and something that felt disturbingly like abandonment. She watched as he approached the car. Two men in dark suits emerged. They were not his. Their posture was different, less disciplined, more overtly aggressive. An argument started. She couldn't hear the words, only the sharp, guttural cadence of raised voices. The tension was a visible thing, a coiling snake in the dim twilight. Then, it happened. It was a flicker of movement from the edge of the woods that bordered the estate, a glint of metal in the fading light. It wasn't a thought. It was pure instinct, a primal scream that died in her throat. She didn't know why she did it. She didn't know what drove her, but she ran. She flew out of the room, her bare feet slapping against the cold marble of the hallway. She ignored the startled call of a passing servant. She took the grand staircase 2-3 steps at a time, her hand barely grazing the polished banister. The front doors were heavy, but she threw them open with a surge of adrenaline. The cold air hit her like a physical blow. Draven! The name was torn from her, a raw, desperate sound. He turned his head at her cry, his eyes widening in disbelief, and in that split second of distraction, the world erupted in a symphony of violence. The first shot was a sharp crack that shattered the evening quiet. The second was a sickening thud as Dmitri crumpled to the ground. The men from the car drew their own weapons. The glint in the woods became a muzzle flash. But Serafina's eyes were locked on Draven. He was moving, not towards cover, but towards her. His face was a mask of cold, terrifying fury, his eyes blazing with a protective fire she had never seen. Another shot rang out, this one whining past her head, so close she felt the displaced air on her cheek. She froze, a deer caught in the glare of oncoming death. Draven reached her in 2 long strides. He didn't hesitate. He didn't speak. He simply acted. He slammed into her. his body shielding hers, his arms wrapping around her like bands of steel as he drove them both to the ground behind the stone balustrade of the entryway. The impact knocked the air from her lungs. She landed half beneath him, the rough stone scraping her skin, his weight a crushing, solid presence. She could feel the frantic, heavy beat of his heart against her back. Or maybe it was her own. For a terrifying, surreal moment, all she was aware of was the scent of him, winter woods and gunpowder, and the solid, unyielding wall of his body shielding her from the chaos. The shootout was short, brutal, and ruthlessly efficient. She heard the controlled, double-tap reports of the Volkov guards, a sound distinctly different from the wilder shots of their attackers. Then, silence. A ringing, profound silence, punctuated only by the ragged sound of her own breathing and the groans of a wounded man. Draven didn't move for a long moment. He remained a dead weight on top of her, his head low, listening. Then slowly, he pushed himself up, his movements stiff. His eyes scanned the driveway, the woods, his face a mask of lethal calculation. He looked down at her. His gray eyes were dark, almost black, swirling with a storm of emotions she couldn't begin to name. Fury, fear, and something else, something deeper, that made her breath catch. "Are you hurt?" His voice was a low, rough rasp. She shook her head, unable to find her voice. Her body was trembling, a violent, uncontrollable shiver of adrenaline and shock. He reached out, his hand hovering for a second before his fingers brushed against her cheek, his touch surprisingly gentle as he tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. But as he pulled his hand away, she saw it. The dark crimson stain spreading across the sleeve of his white shirt, just below the shoulder. "You're bleeding," she whispered, the words coming out hoarse, unfamiliar. His gaze followed hers. He looked at the wound with a detached annoyance, as if it were a minor inconvenience, a stain on a favorite suit. "It's nothing," he said, his voice flat. But it wasn't nothing. He had been hit. He had been hit while shielding her. The bullet that had been meant for him, or for her, had found him instead. Guards were swarming the area now, their movements silent and professional. One of them, a man with cold blue eyes, knelt by Draven's side. "Sir, we need to get you inside." Draven's eyes never left Serafina's. He saw the tremor in her hands, the shock in her wide eyes. He saw the smear of dirt on her cheek. He saw the terror she was trying so desperately to hide. The sight seemed to break through his control. The cold mask of the dawn cracked, and for a fleeting second, she saw the man beneath. A man who looked raw, vulnerable, and incandescently furious. Not at the attackers, but at the fact that she had been in the line of fire. He had been coming to a business meeting. A trap he had walked into. And her presence, her reckless, inexplicable cry, had changed the entire equation. It might have saved his life. It had almost certainly ended hers. And he had thrown himself in front of the bullet. The hatred she had nurtured for a decade was a distant, fading echo. The confusion of the library was gone. In their place was a new, terrifying, and undeniable truth, laid bare in the crimson stain on his sleeve. He would have died for her. The monster she had married, the man she had sworn to destroy, had just saved her life at the risk of his own. And in the smoking, silent aftermath of the battle, Serafina knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that nothing would ever be the same again. The world narrowed to the confines of Draven's private study. It was a room that mirrored the man himself. Dark wood, leather-bound books, and an air of disciplined control. But that control was now fractured. A fire roared in the hearth, casting flickering, anxious shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the sterile scent of antiseptic, a smell that warred with the faint aroma of whiskey. A doctor, a man with a gray face and hands that moved with practiced efficiency, had just finished stitching the gash in Draven's arm. The bullet had passed clean through the flesh of his shoulder, a miracle of sheer luck. "You were fortunate, Mr. Volkov," the doctor murmured, packing his bag. a few inches to the left. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Draven, now shirtless save for the clean white bandage stark against his skin, merely grunted in response. He sat in a high-backed leather chair near the fire, a glass of amber liquid in his good hand. He had not said a word to Seraphina since his men had ushered them both inside, his arm a steady, unyielding pressure at her back. But he had refused to let her leave. When she had tried to retreat to her own rooms, he had spoken her name, just once. The word was quiet, laced with an authority that brooked no argument. So she stayed, perched on the edge of a sofa, feeling useless and strangely unmoored. She was a witness to the aftermath of a violence she had, in some way, precipitated. The doctor left, closing the door softly behind him, leaving them encased in a ringing silence broken only by the crackle and hiss of the fire. Seraphina's hands were clenched in her lap, her knuckles white. She was no longer trembling, the adrenaline having given way to a heavy, bone-deep chill. She kept seeing it, over and over in her mind's eye. The glint of the rifle, his body slamming into hers, the dark stain spreading on his sleeve. She finally broke the silence, her voice a low, unsteady whisper. "Why did you do that?" He didn't pretend to misunderstand. He stared into the dancing flames, the firelight catching the sharp planes of his face, the dark smudges of exhaustion under his eyes. She could see the faint, silvery lines of old scars on his torso, a roadmap of a life carved by violence. This new wound was just one more mark on a brutal canvas. "They were not supposed to know you were here," he said, his voice a low rumble. The meeting was with the Antonov clan, a discussion of territory. It was a setup, an assassination attempt disguised as diplomacy. He took a slow sip of his whiskey. "Your presence complicated their plans." "I didn't know," she whispered. I ran." "I know." He finally turned his head, and his gray eyes, dark and intense in the firelight, pinned her in place. "You shouldn't have. It was the act of a fool." His words were harsh, but his tone lacked its usual biting edge. There was a weariness there, a raw undercurrent of something else. And it may have been the one thing that saved my life. The admission hung in the air between them. Her reckless act of instinct had created the distraction, the split second of chaos that had turned the tide from a clean assassination to a messy, failed firefight. "They saw you," he continued, his voice hardening. "They saw you run from my house. They heard you call my name. Any value you had as a secret is gone. You are no longer just the Moretti prize. You are Draven Volkov's wife, and in their eyes, that makes you my greatest weakness. His greatest weakness." The words should have felt like a victory, a proof that she held some power over him. Instead, they felt like a death sentence. "So, this is my life now?" she asked, a bitter taste in her mouth. "Hiding in this fortress, waiting for the next bullet?" "This is our life now," he corrected her, and the simple word, "our," changed everything. It was no longer her versus him. It was them versus a world of wolves. "And we will not be hiding. We will be hunting." He stood up, his movements stiff, and walked to the massive oak desk that dominated the room. He flicked on a small brass lamp, illuminating a map of the city, sectioned off into territories marked with different colors. "The Antonovs were pawns," he said, his finger tracing a boundary line. "Too stupid and too weak to plan something like this on their own. Someone else gave the order. Someone who knew about our marriage. Someone who wanted me dead and the city thrown into chaos." He looked up at her, his eyes narrowed, calculating. "Someone who benefits from the old lies." The unspoken words filled the space between them. The lies that separated us. The lies that made us enemies. Seraphina rose from the sofa, drawn by an invisible thread. She walked to the desk, standing beside him, her gaze falling on the map. It was a battlefield, and for the first time, she understood that she was on it, whether she wanted to be or not. "Your father," she said, the words barely a whisper. "The lie about the music box, the lie about my death. It all started with him." My father is dead, Draven said, his voice flat. But his ghost still walks the halls of this organization. There are men who were loyal to him, who believe in his way of doing things. Men who see my methods as a weakness. He turned to face her, his proximity unsettling. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, see the way the firelight deepened the lines of exhaustion on his face. He was wounded, vulnerable in a way she had never imagined possible. He told me love was a disease, Draven said, his voice so low it was almost a confession. He told me the Morettis were a poison that had to be burned out. He used the fire that killed your parents to forge me into what I am. And he used the lie of your death to ensure the steel never softened. The raw honesty of his words stripped the air from her lungs. She looked at him, at this dangerous, powerful man who was feared by an entire city, and saw the broken boy he had once been. The same fire that had destroyed her life had also been used to build his prison. Someone is continuing his work, she said, her voice gaining a strength she didn't know she possessed. They lied to both of us. They tore our families apart, and now they are trying to kill you. She looked from his wounded arm to his hard, determined face. You're right. We can't hide. He watched her, his expression unreadable, but she saw a flicker of something in the depths of his eyes. A reluctant respect. This is not your fight, Serafina. They made it my fight when they shot at me, she countered, her chin lifting. They made it my fight when they orphaned me. I lived in the shadows for 10 years because of these lies. I am done being a ghost. She met his gaze, her own burning with a cold, newfound fire. You know how to hunt monsters, Volkov. But I know the world they came from. I know the old names, the old alliances, the whispers your men will never hear. An alliance. It was an unthinkable, unholy thing. The daughter of the Morettis and the dawn of the Volkovs. A union not of marriage, but of vengeance. A pact sealed in the aftermath of gunfire and the revelation of a shared betrayal. Draven stared at her for a long, silent moment, the firelight dancing in his dark eyes. He was seeing her for the first time, not as a ghost or a prize or a weakness, but as a weapon. Then tell me, he said, his voice a low, dangerous command. Where do we begin? The mansion transformed. The suffocating silence of the gilded cage was replaced by a low, humming tension, the quiet energy of a war room in the hours before a battle. Their unholy alliance began not with a handshake, but with a map. Draven's study became their sanctuary and their battlefield, a neutral territory where the ghosts of Moretti and Volkov could stand side by side, their gazes fixed on a common enemy. For the first time, Serafina was not a prisoner, but a participant. Draven granted her access to the mansion's extensive archives, ledgers, family trees, records of old alliances and betrayals that stretched back generations. While his men, grim-faced and efficient, hunted the Antonov gunmen in the city's underbelly, Serafina hunted for whispers in the ink stains of the past. She worked at the great oak desk, surrounded by stacks of dusty books and brittle documents, while Draven often stood by the window, a dark, restless silhouette against the gray light. He was a caged panther, his arm in a black silk sling, a visible symbol of his forced inaction. The wound prevented him from leading the hunt himself, a fact that chafed at him, radiating a constant simmering frustration. This enforced proximity created a new, far more dangerous kind of tension. The space between them, once a chasm of hatred, was now a live wire of awareness. She became attuned to the small sounds of him, the soft clink of ice in his glass of whiskey, the quiet, rhythmic tap of his fingers on the window pane, the low murmur of his voice on the phone as he gave cold, lethal-sounding orders in Russian. He, in turn, seemed to notice everything about her. He would watch as she pushed a stray strand of hair from her face, her brow furrowed in concentration. He noticed the way she bit her lower lip when she discovered a new connection, a forgotten name. One evening, as the shadows grew long, he walked over and placed a glass of water on the desk beside her. "You haven't eaten since yesterday," he stated, his voice flat, a simple observation. "I'm not hungry," she replied without looking up. Drink it anyway. It was not a request. She found herself obeying, the cool water a balm to her dry throat. The small, almost imperceptible gesture of care was more unsettling than any threat he had ever made. Their conversations were clipped, focused, stripped of all but the essential. They were two strategists dissecting a problem. The Antonovs have always been dogs, she mused one afternoon, her finger tracing a name in an old ledger. Loud bark, no bite. They wouldn't have the nerve for this unless they had the backing of a larger house. And a guarantee of protection, Draven added from across the room. Protection they did not receive. My men found the last of the shooters this morning. He was already dead. A professional cleanup. The implication was chilling. Their true enemy was tying up loose ends, erasing their tracks with ruthless efficiency. It has to be someone from the inside, Serafina said, looking up at him. Someone who knew about the meeting. Someone who knew your route. Someone who knew my existence would create the perfect distraction. My father's circle. Draven agreed, his gaze dark. His consigliere, Mikhail, was fiercely loyal to the old ways. But he is a creature of shadow. He would never act so openly. A snake doesn't need to be seen to bite, she countered. He just needs a proxy, a hand to hold the knife. It was in these moments that the change was most palpable. He would look at her, a flicker of surprise and reluctant admiration in his eyes. He had married a pawn. He was discovering a queen. The shared purpose was a strange, intoxicating intimacy. The thrill of the hunt, the piecing together of the puzzle, became a language they both understood. One night, exhausted, she fell asleep at the desk, her head pillowed on a century-old map of the city. She awoke with a start, not knowing what had disturbed her. The room was dark, save for the soft glow of the desk lamp and the dying orange embers in the fireplace. A heavy wool blanket was draped over her shoulders. It smelled of him. That familiar, unsettling scent of winter woods and cold authority. He was standing by the window, his back to her, looking out at the moonlit gardens. The sling was gone, and he was rolling his wounded shoulder, a wince of pain briefly tightening his features. He had covered her. The gesture was so simple, so unexpectedly tender. It sent a tremor through her. It was the kind of thing the boy with the music box would have done. "You should be in bed," he said, without turning around. "So should you," she replied, her voice soft in the quiet room. "You're injured. It's a scratch." He turned then, and his face was all shadows, his eyes unreadable pools of darkness. "Did you find anything?" "Maybe." Her heart was beating a strange, unsteady rhythm. The hunt felt like a distant, secondary concern. The real danger was here, in this quiet, firelit room. A name. Valery Sokolov. He was one of your father's most trusted enforcers. The ledgers show he retired 10 years ago, right after the fire, given a generous pension. Sokolov, Draven repeated, the name a low growl. The butcher. My father's right hand. I was told he died of illness years ago. Another lie. A pattern was emerging, a web of deceit spun by a dead man, its threads still pulling the strings of the living. He had a sister, Serafina continued, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes locked with his. She married into the Antonov family. The connection clicked into place, sharp and final. It was the missing link, the scent of truth they had been hunting for. But the triumph of the discovery was completely overshadowed by the sudden, suffocating intensity of the atmosphere. He moved away from the window, closing the distance between them. He stopped on the other side of the desk, his hands resting on the polished wood. He was so close she could feel the heat of him, see the faint scar that cut through his left eyebrow. The air was thick, heavy, charged with a decade of unspoken history and a week of undeniable electric tension. "You are remarkable," he said, the words a low, rough confession. It was not a compliment. It was a statement of fact, torn from him against his will. The desire was a sudden, shocking thing. It rose in her, unbidden and undeniable, a treacherous warmth spreading through her veins. It was a terrifying cocktail of fascination, fear, and a deep, resonant pull towards the man he was, and the boy he had been. She saw him not as a monster or a savior, but as a man, wounded and complex, his darkness a mirror of her own. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze dropping from her eyes to her lips. The air crackled. The world shrank to the space between their faces. This was more dangerous than any assassin's bullet. This was a different kind of annihilation, a surrender she had never anticipated. The hunt for the truth had led them to an entirely different discovery. And as he stood there, his shadow falling over her, Serafina knew that the greatest threat was not the enemy hiding in the shadows, but the one standing right in front of her. The moment stretched, thin and taut, threatening to snap. Draven's gaze on her lips was a physical touch, a brand of heat that made her skin flush. The space between them hummed with a dangerous energy, a magnetic pull that was equal parts threat and promise. Serafina's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, wild thing caught in a cage. To close the distance would be madness. To pull away, an act of cowardice her pride would not allow. It was Draven who broke the spell. He pushed himself back from the desk with a sudden, sharp movement, as if recoiling from a flame. He turned away from her, presenting his back, a wall of disciplined muscle and rigid control. He walked to the fireplace, resting his good arm on the marble mantelpiece, staring down into the dying embers. The gesture was one of dismissal, but the tension in his shoulders told a different story. He was fighting a battle, and she was both the battlefield and the enemy. "Sokolov," he said, his voice a low, rough growl, forcing the conversation back to the cold, hard facts of their hunt. "If he is alive, Mikhail will know where he is." The moment was gone. The fragile, terrifying intimacy shattered. Serafina was left with the ghost of a touch that had never happened, her pulse a frantic echo in the sudden emptiness. A strange mix of relief and a sharp, piercing disappointment warred within her. "And you think he'll just tell you?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside. "Mikhail is my consigliere," Draven stated, his back still to her. "His loyalty is to the head of the family, to me. His loyalty was to your father," she corrected him softly. "You said it yourself. He believes in the old ways. Then I will persuade him." The words were laced with ice, a chilling reminder of the man he was, the power he wielded. The following day, Draven summoned Mikhail. Serafina was not present for the meeting, a clear and deliberate exclusion. It was Volkov business. She watched from the upper gallery as the older man, thin and wiry as a dried serpent, walked into Draven's study. His face was a mask of placid respect, but his eyes, small and dark, missed nothing. She felt a chill crawl up her spine. That man was a ghost from her nightmares, a face she remembered from the periphery of her childhood, always lurking in her father's shadow, and then in Draven's. The meeting lasted for hours. When the door finally opened, Mikhail emerged, his expression as unreadable as ever. He paused at the bottom of the stairs, and his dark eyes lifted, finding her in the shadows of the gallery. He held her gaze for a single, unnerving second. There was no threat in the look, no overt malice. There was only a cold, reptilian knowing. Then he turned and was gone. Serafina waited, her nerves stretched taut. When she finally descended and entered the study, she found it empty. The fire was out. The room was cold. A feeling of dread, heavy and suffocating, settled over her. She found him later that night, not in the study, but in the one place she had never dared to venture, the master suite. His side of it. The adjoining door was ajar, a sliver of low light spilling into her room. She hesitated, then pushed it open. He was standing on a private balcony, a dark silhouette against a sky littered with cold, distant stars. The wind was sharp, whipping at the thin silk of his shirt. His bandaged arm was free of the sling, and he held a bottle of vodka in his good hand, no glass. He was drinking from the bottle, a raw, undisciplined act so at odds with his usual control that it shocked her. She stepped out onto the balcony. The cold stone bit at her bare feet. He didn't seem to register her presence until she was standing a few feet away. "Mikhail lied," he said, his voice thick, slurred just enough to betray the amount he'd had to drink. Stared me in the eye and swore Sokolov died 5 years ago. He produced a death certificate. Forged, of course. But perfect. He took another long pull from the bottle. He is loyal to a ghost. He is protecting my father's legacy of lies. The raw frustration and helplessness radiating from him were a palpable force. For all his power, for all his control, he was being stonewalled by the very foundation of his empire. "So we've reached a dead end," she said, the words feeling hollow. "There are no dead ends," he growled, turning to face her. His eyes were wild, a storm of fury, and something that looked like pain. "Only harder roads." He gestured with the bottle towards the sleeping city. "I could tear this city apart, brick by brick. I could bleed every last one of my father's men until someone talks. It would work, but it would start a war. A war that would make what happened to your family look like a prelude." He was trapped. Trapped by his own code, by the responsibility that came with his crown. To find the truth, he would have to destroy the kingdom he was sworn to protect. He looked at her then, and the fury in his eyes softened, replaced by a raw, profound agony that mirrored her own. "He showed me the melted box, you know," he said, his voice dropping to a haunted whisper. "My father, he put the charred lump of metal in my hand and said, 'This is what happens to weakness. This is what happens to love. It burns. Let it burn.'" He was no longer looking at her, but through her, into a past she could only imagine. I believed him. I let that fire burn away everything. The boy you knew. I held his funeral right alongside yours. The confession, raw and steeped in alcohol and grief, broke through the last of her defenses. This was not the dawn. This was not the monster. This was Draven. Wounded, broken, and lost. She did not think. She acted. She closed the small distance between them, and her hand came up, her fingers gently touching the side of his face. His skin was cold from the night air, the stubble of his beard a rough contrast to her soft touch. The contact was electric, a silent explosion in the cold night. He flinched, his eyes snapping back into focus, locking on her. He stared at her as if he'd never seen her before. His hand came up, covering hers, his thumb stroking the back of her wrist. His touch was hesitant, almost reverent. The bottle slipped from his other hand, falling to the stone with a dull, heavy thud. It did not break. "Serafina," he breathed, her name a sound of both prayer and curse. All the tension, all the denial, all the hatred and desire and grief of the past 10 years culminated in that single, shattering moment. The masks were gone. There were no more lies between them. There was only the cold night air, the ghost of a lullaby, and a shared, unbearable pain. He leaned in, his head bowing towards hers. It was not the hungry advance of a dawn claiming his prize. It was the slow, inexorable surrender of a man who had been fighting a war on too many fronts for too long. The truth was not about Sokolov, or Mikhail, or a decade-old fire. The truth was this. It had always been this. Just them. And as his lips finally met hers, it was not a kiss of passion, but of absolution. A quiet, desperate, and utterly devastating ceasefire in a war that had never truly ended. The kiss was not an ending, but a beginning. It was a silent treaty signed in the cold starlight, an acknowledgement of a truth that was now more powerful than any lie. It did not erase the past or solve the future, but it irrevocably altered the present. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the mansion shifted. The tension did not vanish, but its nature changed. The brittle, sharp edges of hostility softened into a heavy, watchful intimacy. They did not speak of what happened on the balcony. Words felt inadequate, clumsy. Instead, They communicated in shared glances across the study, in the way he would pass her a cup of coffee without asking, in the way she would find a book of old Moretti family history left open on the desk to a relevant page. They were still hunting, but now they were hunting as one, a singular entity with a shared mind. Draven's focus became absolute. The vulnerability he had shown on the balcony was locked away, replaced by a cold, lethal clarity. He knew Mikhail was the key, and he began to move his pieces on the board with a terrifying precision, tightening a silent, invisible net around his father's old consigliere. He reassigned Mikhail's guards, promoted men loyal to him into key positions, and began a systematic audit of financial records, searching for the flow of money that was funding the ghost of his father's regime. Serafina, meanwhile, felt a strange sense of peace settle over her for the first time in a decade. The hatred that had been her constant fuel was gone, and in its absence, she was rediscovering the woman she had been before the fire. She found herself sketching again, a childhood passion long forgotten, filling pages with charcoal drawings of the stark, beautiful lines of the winter gardens. The cage had, impossibly, started to feel like a sanctuary. It was this newfound peace that made her careless. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Elena brought her the phone, a small, sleek device reserved for secure communications. "It is your brother, madam." Serafina's heart leaped. Draven had upheld his promise, arranging weekly calls, but this one was unscheduled. She took the phone, her hand trembling slightly. "Leo? Is everything all right?" "Fina, you have to see this." His voice, still boyish but with the first rough edges of adolescence, was crackling with excitement. "The stables here are incredible. There's a new foal. He was just born. The stable master said I could name him." The pure, uncomplicated joy in his voice was a balm to her soul. "Oh, Leo, that's wonderful. You have to come see him, please. Mr. Volkov's head of security is here, a man named Mikhail. He's driving back to the city this afternoon. He said he would be honored to escort you here for a visit if Mr. Volkov approved. He said it was perfectly safe. Could you ask him? Please, Fina." A cold dread trickled down Serafina's spine, slick and immediate. Mikhail. The name was a venomous serpent in the Eden of her brother's call. It was too perfect, too coincidental. "Leo, listen to me," she said, her voice tight. "I don't think that's a good idea right now." "Why not?" The disappointment in his voice was a sharp pang. "It's just for a few hours. Mikhail said the threat was over. He said Mr. Volkov neutralized the Antonovs and that everything is secure. He was feeding Leo lies, using her brother's innocence as a weapon. I'll speak with Draven," she said, the name feeling natural on her lips for the first time. "I'll call you back, Leo. I promise." She hung up, her mind racing. Draven was not at the mansion. He had been called to a meeting at the port, a sudden shipping issue that had demanded his personal attention. She was alone, with Mikhail's offer hanging in the air. It was a trap. Her every instinct screamed it. Mikhail knew Draven was away. He knew a plea from Leo was the one thing that might override her caution. He was trying to lure her out of the fortress. She went in search of Dmitri's second-in-command, a man named Stefan, the one with the cold blue eyes who had helped Draven after the attack. She would tell him about the call, warn him. She found him in the security hub, a room of monitors and blinking lights hidden in the west wing. But he wasn't alone. Mikhail was there. He was standing beside Stefan's chair, a hand resting on the younger man's shoulder. He was smiling, a thin, placid smile that did not reach his dark eyes. Stefan's face was pale, his expression strained. On the monitor in front of them was a live feed from a hidden camera. It showed a boy with dark, unruly hair, laughing as he stroked the nose of a spindly-legged foal. "Leo." "Ah, Serafina," Mikhail said, his voice smooth as silk. "I was just telling Stefan what a delightful young man your brother is. So full of life. It would be a tragedy if anything were to happen to him." The threat was not even veiled. It was a naked blade laid on the table. Stefan didn't move, his gaze fixed on the screen, on the image of the vulnerable, oblivious boy. Mikhail's hand on his shoulder was not a gesture of camaraderie. It was a leash. "The car is waiting, my dear," Mikhail continued, his smile widening. "Your brother is so looking forward to your visit, and I'm afraid he'll be terribly disappointed if you refuse. Children can be so fragile." He was holding Leo hostage from a distance. He had control of the security at the country estate. Any word from her, any attempt to signal Draven, and he could give an order that would... She couldn't complete the thought. Rage, cold and pure, burned away her fear. This man, this serpent, was the architect of it all. The whispers in the ear of Draven's father, the lies, the fire. He was the ghost who had haunted her life. She met his gaze, her own eyes chips of ice. She would not let him see her fear. She would not give him the satisfaction. "I'll need to get my coat," she said, her voice perfectly calm. Mikhail's smile was triumphant. "Of course, my dear. We have all the time in the world." As she walked from the room, her posture poised and regal, she felt his eyes on her back. She was walking willingly into the serpent's nest. She had no plan, no weapon, no way to call for help. But she was no longer just the Moretti ghost. She was the wife of the Volkov Don, and she would not be a pawn in this game. As she ascended the grand staircase, she caught sight of her own reflection in a large, gilt-edged mirror. Her face was pale, her eyes burning with a desperate, defiant fire. She was walking towards her potential death, but for the first time in her life, she was not a victim being led to the slaughter. She was a queen, walking onto the battlefield to protect the final, most important piece of her kingdom, and she would burn this world to ash before she let him harm her brother. The drive was a silent, suffocating ordeal. Serafina sat in the back of a black sedan, the leather cool against her skin, a stark contrast to the fire in her veins. Mikhail sat beside her, a placid, venomous presence, while a driver she didn't recognize navigated the city streets. They were not heading north towards the country. They were heading east, towards the decaying industrial heart of the city, the docks. Her heart sank, but her expression remained a mask of detached calm. Leo was never the destination. He was only the bait. Meanwhile, Draven stood in a cavernous, echoing warehouse at the port, the air thick with the smell of salt and diesel. The shipping issue had been a ghost, a phantom problem that had evaporated upon his arrival. It had taken him less than 5 minutes to realize the truth. It was a lure, a perfectly executed maneuver to draw him away from the mansion, away from her. A cold dread, an emotion he hadn't truly felt since the night of the fire, coiled in his gut. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over her contact number. He didn't call. If she was in danger, a phone call would only escalate it. Instead, he called the one man he trusted implicitly. Stefan. The call went straight to voicemail. That was all the confirmation he needed. The dread solidified into ice-cold certainty. He was already moving, striding towards his car, barking orders into the phone to his personal guard. Full tactical alert. Track my wife's security detail. Now. He thought of her back at the mansion, protected by dozens of men, surrounded by walls of stone. But a fortress is only as strong as its gatekeepers, and Mikhail, the serpent, had been inside the gates all along. He had underestimated the old man's cunning, his sheer audacity. He had been so focused on tightening the net, he hadn't realized the snake was already in his house, its fangs poised to strike the one thing he could not bear to lose. The car carrying Serafina pulled into a deserted container yard. Rusting mountains of steel loomed on all sides, a labyrinth of shadows and decay. The car stopped. "A slight change of plans, my dear," Mikhail said, his smile finally shedding its placid veneer, revealing the predatory cunning beneath. "Your brother sends his regrets. He was detained." The driver's door opened, and a man climbed out. He was large, brutish, a face she recognized from the periphery of old photographs. Valery Sokolov, the butcher. He looked older, his hair grayed, but his eyes held the same dead-eyed cruelty. "It has been a long time, little Rose," Sokolov growled, his voice like grinding gravel. Mikhail opened her door. "After you. Try not to scream. No one will hear you." They led her into a large, empty container. The only light came from the open doors, casting a long, rectangular patch of gray on the dusty floor. The air was cold, metallic. This was a slaughterhouse. "Why?" Serafina asked, her voice steady, betraying none of the terror that was clawing at her insides. She needed to keep him talking. She needed to buy time, though for what, she did not know. "Because he is weak," Mikhail said, his voice dripping with a zealot's conviction. "Your husband. He let sentiment cloud his judgment. He let you live. He allies himself with a Moretti. His father, a great man, a true Don, would have razed your entire bloodline to the ground and salted the earth. He understood that power requires purity. Draven, he is tainted. By you. By his memory of you." He paced in front of her, his movements agitated, passionate. "I have dedicated my life to the Volkov name, to its strength. I will not stand by and watch a boy who mourns a music box drive it into the ground. A new leader is required, one who is not afraid to burn away the weakness." Suddenly, the roar of engines filled the air, a sound of furious, unstoppable power. A fleet of black-armored SUVs swarmed into the container yard, their tires screeching on the pavement. They formed a semicircle, their headlights cutting through the gloom, pinning the container in a blinding glare. Sokolov swore, grabbing Serafina, pulling her back into the shadows of the container, and pressing the cold, hard muzzle of a gun to her temple. Mikhail's face contorted in a mask of fury. He was not supposed to know. A car door slammed. A single figure emerged from behind the blinding lights, walking slowly, deliberately, into the space between the vehicles. It was Draven. He was alone, his hands empty at his sides. He wore no coat, and the wind whipped at his dark suit. He was not a Don coming to negotiate. He was a storm, an executioner. "Let her go, Mikhail." Draven's voice was unnaturally calm, yet it carried across the yard, cutting through the thrum of the idling engines. It was the calm at the center of a hurricane. "You are too late, Draven," Mikhail shrieked, his composure shattering. "You see? Your weakness. You came for her yourself. The great Draven Volkov, brought to his knees by a slip of a girl." "I am not on my knees," Draven said, his voice dropping lower, colder. "I am here to remove a sickness from my family. You have abused my father's memory. You have threatened my wife. There is no forgiveness for that." He took another slow, deliberate step forward. Sokolov pressed the gun harder against Serafina's temple. One more step, and she dies. Serafina's heart was a cold, hard knot in her chest. She looked at Draven, his face a mask of lethal intent, his gray eyes fixed on her. In them, she did not see fear. She saw a promise. She did the only thing she could. She acted. With a sudden, violent movement, she stomped her heel down, hard, on Sokolov's instep. He roared in pain, his grip faltering for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She threw her head back, smashing it into his face, and dropped to the ground, curling into a ball. The world exploded. A single shot, louder than anything she had ever heard, echoed in the metal container. It was not from Sokolov's gun. She looked up. Draven was standing at the mouth of the container, a pistol in his hand, a thin wisp of smoke curling from the barrel. His stance was perfect, unwavering. Sokolov lay on the ground behind her, a neat, dark hole in the center of his forehead. He had not even had time to scream. Mikhail stared, his mouth agape, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. He looked from the dead butcher to the avenging dawn. The serpent had been defanged. Draven walked into the container, his steps measured, his eyes never leaving Mikhail's. He did not look at Serafina. He did not look at the body on the floor. His entire universe was focused on the man who had betrayed him. "You were my father's most trusted friend," Draven said, his voice a low, chilling whisper. "You were my teacher, my advisor." He stopped directly in front of the trembling old man. "You were family." He raised the pistol, the movement fluid, economical. "And family," he said, his voice breaking with a decade of repressed grief and rage, "does not lie about the dead." Mikhail closed his eyes. Draven pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. When the ringing in her ears subsided, Serafina pushed herself up. Mikhail lay on the ground, his reign of whispers and shadows over. Draven stood over the bodies, his shoulders heaving, the pistol hanging loosely in his hand. The storm had passed, leaving a devastating calm in its wake. He finally turned to her, and his eyes, when they met hers, were stripped bare of all artifice. She saw the rage, the grief, the fear, and beneath it all, an overwhelming, soul-deep relief. He crossed the space between them in 2 strides and knelt before her. He reached out, his hand shaking slightly, and cupped her face, his thumb stroking away the tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "Are you hurt?" he whispered, the same words he had spoken after the first attack, but this time they were filled with a raw, desperate tenderness. She shook her head, unable to speak. She leaned into his touch, her hand coming up to cover his. The lies were dead. The ghosts were banished. The fire, which had been set all those years ago to burn away a weakness, had failed. It had not destroyed them. It had forged them. He helped her to her feet, his arm a solid, grounding presence around her. They walked out of the dark container and into the blinding light of the waiting cars. The vow they had made in the cold chapel, a vow of convenience and lies, was meaningless now. In the embers of their shared past, in the ashes of the men who had torn them apart, they had forged a new one, an unspoken vow, sealed not with words, but with blood and survival, and a truth that was more powerful than any empire. They were not just Adon and his wife. They were Draven and Serafina. And they were finally home.